RC1000 class reflection, where I reflect on my research paper and podcast that I made in this course. I am satisfied with how my paper represents my research, learning, and my thinking about the topic because the main purpose of my argumentative essay was to persuade an audience that the recruiting process for field hockey was too early. I think I effectively reached my purpose through the sources I used. I used an interview with Rachel Flagg, a current freshman on App State's field hockey team, and Roxy Day, a former player on App's team who ended up quitting the end of her sophomore year and went on to pursue other things. I interviewed Emily Dinsmore, the assistant field hockey coach at App. I also used research from scholarly sources and the National Collegiate Athletics Association's website to add to my research. My research is relevant and brings in new ideas to support my topic, and my analysis helps develop my research more and relate it back to my thesis. While I am satisfied with my research and analysis, I am not satisfied with my sentence structure and grammar. After rereading my essay, I noticed many sentences were run on. I noticed I switched tenses a lot and make small grammatical mistakes throughout my essay. By writing this paper, I feel I met and exceeded two of the course goals, one which was uses writing and reading for learning, thinking, and communicating. I feel I exceeded this goal because over this course I have learned to write a research paper and I have learned all the components that I need to be in a research paper. Through reading the book They Say, I Say, I have learned how to introduce an argument and communicate my thoughts with what I have to say to my audience. Another goal I feel I have met and exceeded in this course is I can effectively locate, evaluate, analyze, synthesize, and document primary and secondary sources. I've met this goal through the source searches we have done. I looked through many sources and evaluated them, trying to see if they would benefit my research paper. I have learned to evaluate and analyze secondary sources like websites, and I have learned to evaluate and analyze primary sources like my interviews done with Emily Dinsmore, Roxy Day, and Rachel Flagg in order to use them to compose my research paper. When shifting gears from writing an academic paper for a college writing teacher to creating a podcast for a different self-selected audience, it is just important to know who your audience is. For my paper, my audience was my teacher and coffee house group, none of which knew anything about field hockey, so I had to be thorough in my explanations about the recruiting process. For my podcast, my audience changed to be field hockey players in high school who were looking to play in college. Since my audience already knows about the recruiting process and the recruiting rules, I did not transfer the information on recruiting rules from my essay to my podcast. It is crucial you understand your audience so you know what information to put in the podcast and what information to leave out. I think my podcast met and exceeded our course goal of analyzing and responding appropriately to different kinds of rhetorical situations. Making a podcast is a different rhetorical situation than writing a research paper. A podcast is more creative and open-ended, while a research paper is strictly facts and analyzing. I think I exceeded this goal because I knew what I needed to put in my podcast to make it interesting while still achieving my purpose. In my podcast, I included my personal experience on the recruiting process, and I also included an interview that was not done in my paper. In my podcast, my purpose was to inform players on my experience of the recruiting process and explain the pros and cons of early recruiting so athletes get a better idea of how to go about the recruiting process. Through feedback I got on my podcast, I know I achieved this purpose. For example, from feedback I got from Hannah Green, she says she loved the podcast. It was very effective on the pros and cons of recruiting. This really helped me put into perspective of how the whole process works and how stressful it can be. I appreciate knowing how it works so I know what to look for and what to expect. I informed her on the pros and cons of early recruiting and informed her about how the process works through my personal experience. I would say I met this goal because I effectively altered my essay into a podcast that still got my purpose across to the audience. While I did meet my purpose, I did not effectively edit my podcast. I was supposed to include an added interview I did with Roxy Day. The interview would have explained Roxy joined a sorority and is continuing to finish her schooling at App State, but if she started the recruiting process later in high school, she would have realized she didn't want to play in college and would have chosen to go to a different college. It would have shown the downside to early recruiting and proved that when you commit early in high school, you don't know what to look for because you are still trying to find out who you are. From the beginning of the semester to now, I feel I have grown as a writer. In the first reflection I wrote in this class, I said, I feel like I am a bad writer because it takes me a long time to come up with ideas, and when I do, it takes me a long time to put my thoughts into words. I have improved upon this throughout the course because each week we would slowly build on our research, which helped me better compose my thoughts. I usually sit down and do all my work at once, which is probably why it is so hard for me to come up with ideas, but this course has forced me to split my research into sections and outline my paper. This really helped me in the writing process. In the first reflection, I also said, my writing often does not make sense on paper. I have all my thoughts together in my head, but I cannot relay them to the paper well. I feel I have improved on this because I feel my essay made sense. All I did in the essay was quote and analyze my quotes, so it was hard for me to get off topic. I focused on relating each analysis back to my claim in my research paper, which I think helped make my essay better. Usually I just analyze the quote and never tie in the quote with my claim. I am very proud of my work in RC 1000 because I have never written a research paper. English has never been my strong suit, so writing a 9-page research paper is a big accomplishment for me. I'm also proud of my podcast because I have also never made one before. I think it was a fun experience and was a creative way to change up the research paper. I am proud of my podcast because I feel I made it interesting and got my purpose across to my audience. Now that wraps up my first year RC 1000 course.